All right, stone tools. Survival with a knife is camping. If you are out there and you have a knife, life is easy. Things are very, very, very much easier if you have some sort of steel tool. But stone tools are very effective. Stone tools were not replaced because they're not effective. Stone tools were only replaced because the metal tools are easier to manufacture and easier for the lay person to maintain. But there's nothing in the world sharper than obsidian. An obsidian flake, obsidian breaks to the last micron of its existence, and it slides between your cells. And there's nothing on the face of this planet that is sharper than it. Nothing. Okay, it is the sharpest substance. A clean flake is the sharpest thing in the world. So it's very effective. Okay, it was only replaced because metal tools were much easier to manufacture. For survival, all you need is one flake. Refined tools are nice. If you can make yourself a spear point, or a saw, or a drill bit, or an arrowhead, that's all well and good. Okay? These are pretty, but they're not effective. You don't have to have one of these. They're not the only thing that's effective, I should say. They are effective. It's not the only thing that's effective. Okay? All you need for survival is a sharp flake, a sharp edge. So don't get it in your mind that you're aiming for this. The only way you get to this, to be able to make stuff like this, is if you can effectively remove one of these flakes and predict how it's going to remove. So there are maybe, let's say, 7 main uses for stone tools. 7 different ways you're going to be using stone tools. One is striking, just a rock that you're going to be striking other things with. Just smashing stuff up with, a mano metate. Another one would be chopping. My green stone chopper. Now this is made differently. I'll explain how this is made. It's different from what I'm mostly going to be talking about. There's sanding and abrading. Some sort of sandstone. So you're going to abrade wood with. Ooh, that works really well. Yeah, I'm destroying this table. Sweet. You're going to use it like a straight edge. You know, like you're using like a sawing cut back and forth. Which would be this. Right here, that's a saw. It's for cutting wood with. You're going to have stuff that you're going to use like a scraper, a lateral edge, a scraper, where you're scraping. Okay, not slicing, cutting, but scraping. I don't have a scraper sitting here, unfortunately. You got your circular motion, a drill bit. Oh, burn it.
Yeah.
I made a burn yesterday, but I can't find it.
Up here.
Yeah, there's like a circular motion, which would be either like a drill bit, like a little point that you put at the end of something and spin like hand drill or bow drill, or a really commonly used tool is called a burin, which is just like a similar shaped, pointy edge that's nice and thick, and you're using it with your fingers like that, or to score things. You know, like you score a piece of bone and just scrape out with it's called a burin. I can't find it, so there's no point in even talking about it. And then you have piercing uses, like arrowheads, spear points, and the like. And all of them have different shapes that you're going to go for, and I'll explain them as we go through the actual manufacture. So, finding knappable stones. Where do you go to find knappable stones? Okay, there's knappable stones all over the country, all over the world. and there's different grades of them, and you can usually get one or sometimes more of a really higher grade knappable material. But every stone is knappable. You can work any stone. Some of them just aren't worth all the trouble.
Knappable meaning?
Meaning you can take flakes from it. We're not into it yet, but flint knapping is essentially what I'm going to be talking about. But it's not just flint knapping, because there's lots of terms are going to be thrown out today. So finding knappable stones. Where do you go to find knappable stones? Well, like I said, they're all over the country. They're all over the world. And you're not going to go and find the highest grade everywhere you go. So what you want to do is you want to start tapping on stones, and you're listening for a high-pitched ring. Listen to that as compared to that.
Higher pitch.
Okay. Preferably, you're going to tap on like a skinnier part of the stone, because when it's really thick, you can't hear much of the metallic ring. You hear that? I mean, it's not much of a ring to it, but then you tap it over here and it's... I mean, I can hear the high pitch to it. I don't know, it might be a little bit too far away for you guys to hear really well. But you're just going to tap on stones, and you're going to listen for that high-pitched ring. Or if you want, you can just get yourself another stone and just start breaking every rock you see until you get a flake to come off. Because that's probably how this was all figured out. Thak comes out of his cave/hut, and he's got his rock, and he's all thinking about something. He's like, "Oh!" Smashes the stone down, and it breaks into 50 pieces, and one of them flies past and cuts his leg. He's like, "Oh, oh, oh, oh."
Good barlow.
And that's probably how this all started. So you can be like Thak and just smash everything you see until something breaks just right, or you can try to be a little more refined. Go out and tap on stones. Oh yes, high-pitched and metallic. I'm so much more intelligent than Thak. You can also look for flake scars on a rock. The flake scars are very distinctive, and you'll see them once I get into the... I mean, you've probably seen them if you've been looking up here. Here, that's a pretty good example of it. These are all flake scars on this part of the rock that you're looking at. So you're just looking for the where a flake came off. It leaves a very distinctive scar pattern. Riverbeds are generally pretty good for looking in because you don't have to dig very much, but the downside is that most of the rocks have been tumbled in the riverbed, and every time it gets tumbled, it potentially sends a fracture through the rock. Sometimes those fractures don't go very far, so it's easier because you don't have to dig as much, but it's less desirable because the stones are going to be a little bit more difficult to work because they've been tumbled in a riverbed. And if you're going to go to a place like Glass Buttes or, what is the name of that stuff? Like the place where they get Burlington Chert in Texas and these different quarry places, basically, you're going to expect to dig or to want to dig because you're going to be exposing cleaner rocks, more homogeneous, less damaged, less weather-beaten rocks, and it does make a big difference, yes.
What about around the edge of farmers' fields?
Farmers' fields are really good as well. Basically anywhere, generally speaking though, if you're in a farmer's field, there's not going to be as much of it, and you're going to want a larger vein. Like if you're going and you're just finding surface cobbles, most of those are there because they've been beaten up by some sort of process, whether it's weathering, eroding from a cliff. So yeah, if you got a farmer who's got mostly rocks in his field, then sure, but it's not going to turn up too much because it's mostly soil in their fields, and anything that's there is just there by you're probably right next to where it's good, some good rocks. But I generally wouldn't go to a farmer's field, but you know what the heck, you can find all sorts of stuff in unexpected places. I found some stuff, like I was taking a bus to South Dakota and we were somewhere in Missouri, and I just started walking and went and ended up at the edge of this quarry, and they weren't quarrying the stone I was looking for. They were just moving that out of the way, and there was just this big, huge pile of chert. And I was just like, oh, let me see that. Broke the first one. It broke really well. And I was like, damn it, I don't have any room in my backpack. So I was like coming back on the bus with like bags full of rocks. You're like, what the hell are you doing, buddy? But people on the bus, they just know that you're probably crazy in the first place. So they don't really mess with you too much. It's kind of nice. If you live in an area where there's not as much stone, now I've had a debate with this friend of mine, but going down to St. Croix, there's not any high-grade knappable stone. They had stuff that was really good for the, like I said, this is a different process, like a greenstone or a basalt, which is you're going to be using differently, and I'll explain how you work one of those. But I got this flint, and I'm pretty sure this was ship ballast. This was brought over as ballast. We get a lot of ballast flint in the Delaware Bay. So back in the day, for ballast, instead of pumping water into the bottom of the boats coming across to keep the boat upright, instead of pumping water in there because they didn't have mechanical pumps and steel hulls, they would load the bottom of their ships with flint or other rocks. They just used a lot of, it's not high quality flint because they were keeping that for themselves. And they would load up all the flint, then they'd get here, and they'd dump all of their flint, and then pick up goods and put those in the bottom of their ship as ballast, and then go back. So there's places you can go and score ballast flint. Most of the time it's generally underwater, but a lot of times dredges will pick that stuff up. And so this stuff washes up on certain beaches in St. Croix. I'm pretty sure it's Danish flint, but another guy says that he thinks it occurs there. But I've only ever found it on like 2 beaches. And there's no big vein of it anywhere around I can find, so I'm pretty sure that's where this is from. But keep your eyes open for that. So we're talking about finding rocks, and I said every rock is knappable, but there's better rocks and there's worse rocks. So there's something that's called the lithic scale. Lithic scale. Lithic. L-I-T-H. Lithic. Lithics are rocks. It's a scientific term for rocks. Lithics. So the lithic. Yeah, exactly, like the Neolithic or the Paleolithic. So the lithic scale, and that's something that you're going to use if you buy rocks or if you're talking to other nappers or you go to some nap-in and you want to know how hard or how difficult or easy a rock is to work. Then the lithic scale is a gradient of how easy the stone is to work. And the scale goes from 0 to 5. And 0 would be like a black obsidian would be 0. Okay, very workable. I don't want to say more brittle, but I guess that's the best way to describe it. More brittle, it works more easily, it removes the flake the most easily and the most cleanly. And then a 5, and I don't have any sitting in front of me, unfortunately, although it's all over the place. 5 would be a quartzite. Still readily workable, but on the edges of it. Find a tiny one. All these little white stones, these are all quartzite. And these are obviously a little bit too small to be very easily workable, but it is possible to work these stones. Okay, so quartzite will be like a 5, and then you have all sorts of different other kinds of stone. You have like this is called Rainy Buttes. This is from Rainy Buttes, North Dakota. This is a petrified wood. This would be probably like a 2 or a 3 on that lithic scale. This flint right here would probably more towards a 4 than a 3 because it's got all this crap in it, but your true flints would be like a 3. There's only one true flint in North America. It's called Knife River Flints from Ohio. But doesn't matter what kind of rock it is. Doesn't matter what its name is. Doesn't matter where it comes out on the scale. Okay, if it's breakable, you're gonna break it.
What makes quartzite so difficult to work with?
It's full of tiny fissures.
Okay, so
It's full of tiny fissures. Plus, it's just really hard. It's just a tough stone. It's not as brittle as obsidian, so it doesn't like to break as easily.
So like the level 5 stuff is just.
It's just really hard to work with. Boy, you're a ninja. I can't see you.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
But does the level 5 things, do they make more like sturdy like tools?
Yes, they do. I was waiting for somebody to ask that question. Yes. Now, somebody was saying lithic like Neolithic, like Paleolithic. Now, flint knapping as an art form spiked during the Paleolithic times and then steadily downgraded since then. People's skill level during the Paleolithic times was higher than at any other time in history. Even nowadays, like the general populace doesn't have any clue in the world, how to make a decent arrowhead, and 99% of the people you run into don't even know what a quality arrowhead is. I mean, you stop at those rock shops and they're like, arrowheads, and there's like a bin of arrowheads for like 50 cents a piece, and it's basically just like a flake that somebody just took and like roughly broke into a triangle shape and threw it into a bin to sell for 50 cents a piece. Okay, most people have no idea what a usable arrowhead even looks like. But back in the Paleolithic days, they knew, and they had to make these really, really well-made, really refined tools. And I saw one out of quartzite that was a perfectly flaked spearhead out of quartzite that would probably cut through your car and still stay sharp on the other end. So yes, it's much, much harder to work, but when you get a usable tool out of it, it lasts a really long time. So there's the advantage of using something that's a little bit higher. So, but like I said, every rock is knappable. Now, when you are looking for rocks and you're trying to make a nice tool, you want to preferably find the most homogeneous rocks. What I mean by homogeneous is if you look at this right here, you can see there's the gray part is the flint, and then there's this chalky stuff coming up through it, and there's some chalky stuff over here. And I think this is the only example I have, and this is pretty simple as pretty similar as well. You see, it's got all this good stone in there, but then there's this chalky stuff that comes right through the middle of it. Okay, you want to look for any chalky stuffs, any weird chunks. You want to look for any cracks that were pre-existing in the rock, because those are going to make it impossible too. And those impurities in the rock are called inclusions. And you want to look for a stone with as little inclusions. But if you pick up rocks that do have a bunch of inclusions and fractures and stuff like that in it, and you're knapping them, and they break along those natural lines, you're just like, oh, well, it wasn't my fault. Sweet. So now you know, anytime you're flint knapping and somebody's like, why did it break? You'd be like, it wasn't my fault. There must have been some inclusion or fracture in the rock. It happened before I picked it up. So, tools for percussion making, percussion tool making. Okay, the tools that you will use for direct percussion. Okay, we are talking about percussion tool making. Now, the next class we do flint knapping, but it's all pressure flaking, which I'm not going to get into. But it's the same principle on a smaller scale, and instead of striking the rock, you're prying flakes from the rock. Okay, so this is all for striking, and believe me, all you need to know is the striking. You can do everything you need with percussion.
Prying flakes is to make a sharp edge.
Prying flakes is that when it gets down to this size, and I try to hit it with something, the likelihood of it breaking is very high. So the pressure flaking is the next step up, although it's all part of the same thing. What's that? Pressure flaking? Yeah, this is just one tool for pressure flaking. You can use that as well. Yep. You can use that as well. This is called an Ishii stick. This is what he used, a longer stick to get extra force, and so a lot of knappers use something similar to that. And mine's all like cheesy and modern looking. Totally cheesy. So the first tool you're going to want, the first thing you're going to want to have in your toolkit is a bunch of Band-Aids. Okay? Bandaging supplies. The first thing you're going to want to make sure you have around. Okay, I've let's see, on this hand I've cut through both tendons. On this hand, and I've sliced my leg like 3 or 4 times. I've cut my fingers too many times to count. From knapping freehand, I've cut my legs with sending flakes into slicing my leg. Okay, you're gonna get cut. Like I said, it's the sharpest thing on the planet. And I can't hold it very well. Plus this flake is kind of dull. Damn it.
What regions does obsidian live in?
Obsidian is a volcanic stone. Woo! Okay, this stuff is very, very sharp. That cuts off pretty easily. Let's test somebody's lost and found knife to see if their lost and found knife is nearly as sharp.
Maybe that's why it's lost.
That person's like, I don't want to find it. So, you know, it definitely cut it, but it took a whole lot more sawing for me to cut that off than it did for the obsidian flake. So if it cuts through leather that easily, you can imagine how easily it's going to cut through you. They do a lot of surgery with obsidian nowadays. There's this guy, I'll probably mention him a couple other times. His name is Eric Callahan. I call him Grandpa Skills. He's done like every single one of these primitive skills, only he didn't have somebody around to learn from, so he just learned it all by just doing it. And like has almost killed himself a number of times eating like poisonous mushrooms and stuff like that. But he had to have rotator cuff surgery, and so he made a bunch of flakes, a bunch of obsidian flakes for that, and no doctors wanted to work with it. And then finally he found a doctor that was willing to work with it, and the doctor was like, that was the best scalpel I've ever used. Because I've got a National Geographic that's got an electron microscope blow up of an obsidian edge next to a scalpel edge, and the scalpel is like pitted and folded and cracked, and the obsidian edge is just a clean edge. Okay, it's what's that?
Like diamond cutting or laser still doesn't have sharp.
Oh no, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing that's as sharp as this. So once that one doctor started using it, other doctors started using it, and they use it back when they used to use things besides lasers for eye surgery. It was pretty popular for eye surgery because there's very little scarring. So that's the reason why I brought it up. So when you do get cut, there's going to be very little scarring. Very clean. Okay, so the first thing you got in your toolkit is your Band-Aids and your bandaging supplies. The next thing you're going to need are some hammerstones. Softer sandstone is going to be the best hammerstones you're going to find. Softer and harder sandstone. Okay, you don't want a really, really hard rock for your hammerstone. You want something that's actually going to grip the edge of the stone. Just for a fraction of a second, the sandstone is going to grip the edge of the material that I'm working and throw off a flake. Okay, so soft, rounded sandstone. You always want your billets and your hammerstones to be rounded because you can be more accurate with a rounded hammerstone or billet than you can with a flat one. Because if I'm swinging this rounded stone at a rock, it's very easy to strike with one point on that rounded stone. If it's flat, you know, you can miss high or miss low. Any of these places along this surface are potentially places where you would be striking the stone. Whereas with this round rock, it's only going to be striking the stone in one place because it's round. Does that make sense? Because it's rounded, you can be more accurate.
It's on the tangent.
What's that?
On the tangent.
Sure. On the tangent, like he said. What does that mean? Ask him.
Basic geometry.
You want it to be solid enough so that it's not going to fall apart when you strike it, but you also need it to be a little bit less brittle than what you're working with. Okay, so if you don't have a really soft sandstone, just find anything that'll work that's a little bit softer than what you're working with, but still is strong enough to hold together. Because some sandstones, you like hit something and it just falls into like 20 pieces. Okay, so these ones came from the beach in California, really good ones. This one came from Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. You can get some really good ones, but you can get sandstone all over the place.
Great Lakes, I went to the Great Lakes, and instead of sand,
Sandstone instead of sand?
all round stone.
Yep.
I mean, big fish-sized round stone.
Yeah, but is it sandstone or is it something else?
They were really crystalline.
Yeah, so you probably
They were
wouldn't be
all
too much
heterogeneous,
sandstone.
though. They were all salt and pepper. It was but it was full of crystal. And
Yeah, you want stuff that's not very like chunky like that, and stuff that has smaller grains to it. If it has really big grains to it, it's going to be too soft, or either too soft or too hard. You want stuff that's mostly sand, like these ones are. You know, that's like mostly sand, preferably. Another thing that you're going to be using are called billets. Billets. And billets are going to be either antler or hardwood. And now modern nappers, which I started on copper, and I do not suggest you start on copper. One of the persons who was teaching there, I came with a piece of antler, and he's like, put that down, pick up copper, and don't learn how to use the antler. And I should not have listened to him, because my learning curve, I was really good with the copper, and then I decided that wasn't very realistic, that if I was out in a survival situation, where the hell am I going to get a piece of copper with lead in it that happened to be machined out? Okay, you're not going to find a machine-rounded, copper-filled, or lead-filled copper billet when you're out in survival. It's just very unlikely. So I decided that I didn't want to use that anymore, and then I had to relearn, because the striking technique is just slightly different. So my suggestion to you is to learn how to use stone and antler before you learn how to use anything modern. But if you get into this and you go out to watch other nappers, you will find people referencing, and you will see people working with copper. If you choose to use the copper, what you want to do is get a copper end cap. You're going to get end caps, which is, you know, like when they make copper piping, there's little caps they make the end for, and preferably you want to round that thing out. Pretty hard to round out. Sometimes you'll luck out and you can get a ball peen hammer, which is the type of hammer that has a little ball at the one end, and you can sometimes find one that will fit the end cap perfectly, and then you just hammer it on a piece of metal until the copper fits around. Until the copper fits around the little ball really well. And you got to fill it with lead, or you can go out and buy copper billets. If you went online and tried to buy copper billets, you can buy kits, flint knapping kits of pre-made billets. But you don't need that copper. You don't need any of that crap. You just go out and find an antler, find a shed antler. This was from a shed antler. You can buy antlers online. My friend bought a bunch of antlers online because they were super cheap. And I got this moose billet from him that he cut from an antler he bought online. This one's an elk antler. Moose and white-tailed deer are going to be the best antlers that you're going to find. Elk antlers are full of pith, soft pith on the inside. I don't know if you guys can see this at all, but there's a really soft pith inside this. And it's pretty easily carvable. I'm going to cut this shit out of myself. Okay, it's really soft. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I'm just carving right into that. And you don't want that soft pith. Okay, you want your antlers to have a little bit of weight to them, because if they don't, you've got to swing really hard. And if you're swinging really hard, your accuracy starts to drop. Okay, so moose is definitely the best. Whitetail is really good. Like this antler has absolutely no pith on it. This is a really, really big 6-point buck shed. If you're going to use hardwood, generally speaking, the lower down on the lithic scale towards a 0 is going to work better with a harder hammerstone. The obsidian really likes a hammerstone. And the higher up you get on the scale, this more difficult to work stuff, like the quartzite, likes a really soft wood. So it's the inverse of what you might think. Why is that? Because when I strike the stone, the energy is moving through the stone, and I want to be able to control that energy. If I hit the stone and there's a lot of force and there's a lot of shock going into that stone, there's all those little fissures, those little micro fractures in the obsidian, or in the quartzite, and the energy is just going to go right in towards those cracks and like shock them apart. Whereas this softer energy, it can travel through those fissures without breaking off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I know it's the inverse of what people are probably thinking, but it just works. Just remember that it works better with a softer wood. Lower on the scale, harder hammerstone. Higher on the scale, softer billet. But prove me right or prove me wrong.
Is your hammerstone
Make some gravel. What's that?
Is your hammerstone still gonna be the same, but the billet is softer, or is the
Yeah. No, you can get softer and harder hammerstones as well. But that's all. Generally, I've been using the billets a lot recently, and you'll find as you go, like you just start to you're swinging, because the strike is a little bit different for the hammerstone than it is for the billet. You'll just find that you're better working with one or the other at a certain point. So, but you still want to be able to have both. Now you'll notice that I have multiple sizes. I got my large hammerstone, I got my small hammerstone, I have a couple that are in between. I have my large billet, and I have my small billet, and I have a couple that are in between. Okay, you need to have different size billets because the size flake that you remove is directly related to the size billet that you use. This is going to remove a small flake, this is going to remove a large flake. Okay, so you want to have different sizes if you can, but if not, you can just swing this thing really hard and get larger flakes. You had a question? Sweet. You are going to want some sort of abrader, some sort of abrasive material. So if you've got a nice soft sandstone, that'll work as an abrader as well. Because what's happening is when you strike the stone, you're sending force into it. You're sending a shock wave through that stone. And if I have a really brittle edge, a really small, skinny, brittle edge, when I strike the rock trying to remove this huge flake, okay, instead of removing that huge flake, the end of this thing will just crumble and break off. Okay, so you need to sturdy up the edge that you're working on, and you do that by abrading it. You take your abrading stone and you're just scrubbing the edge with the abrading stone, and it is sturdying it up so that it is strong enough. Damn, I thought I was going to catch it. No, 5-hole score. Sorry, cheap hockey reference. One guy got it. What's that?
He probably lives in Canada.
He probably does live in Canada. I know you're out there, you Canucks. You're coming to take over.
We look just like everyone else.
Can't have my rocks. Go back to Canada, see? We almost beat you in the Olympics.
So, when you are, well, I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so you got your abraders. You want a leg pad. Okay, a leather leg pad, some sort of sturdy leather leg pad, because all of the work that you do when you're flint knapping is going to be on your leg. If you see people, you will see people working stone freehand, which is where they're just holding the stone and keeping it in their hand. Maybe they're resting their hand on their leg, but it's still freehand. Don't do that. Okay, don't do that. I started doing that, and that was all I was doing for a long time. And you don't even notice it, but just before you strike the stone, your hand moves a little bit. Okay, most every good napper, you know, has done that freehand at a certain point. But I took this class from Dr. Callahan, and he was like, "Don't do that," and I stopped doing it, and I've gotten better since then. So, listen to what he says. Don't do that, because you're controlling the variables much easier if you're working on your leg. So when you're working on your leg, you need some sturdy leather. What's the guy's name? I can't remember his name. He's actually a pretty good flint knapper. I think it was Steve Watts, but I could be wrong. But he's out in his garage and he's flint knapping, and like he's just working on this obsidian, but it's like a huge boulder he's got on his leg, and he's like smacks the thing, and he sends a flake like straight through his leg pad into his leg, like a ways in there, and then it broke off as it went in there, and he's got a chunk of rock in there, and he calls to his wife. He's like stops, and he holds the thing closed. And he calls to his wife, and he's like, bring some tweezers. Bring some tweezers. She comes out, and he's like, all right, I'm going to open it, and you're going to grab the rock. And he pulls his leg open, and she goes in and grabs it, and he, like, closes it back up. And picks his knapping gear back up, and right back at it. Because it's like crack. Once you start, you can't stop. It's as addicting as it comes. It's the most addicting primitive skill. You're going to start, and then it's going to be hours later. You're not going to be able to see straight. You're going to be breathing in all this dust and getting fibrosis. You're not going to be able to breathe right, but you're not going to care. Get some more rocks. You might want some safety gloves. I don't use the gloves very often while I'm working unless I'm working with something really large. If I'm working with a big, huge obsidian boulder and I'm striking these big flakes off, and now I'm handling like a 15-pound dagger, you know? super sharp, razor sharp edge on something that weighs 10 or 15 pounds and is very awkward is kind of a dangerous situation. So you might want some gloves. It's also highly recommended that you would wear some sort of eye protection, which I don't tend to do because I'm dumb. And that's okay. It's really highly recommended that you wear some safety glasses. If you wear glasses, then just wear your glasses. If not, then you can just close your eyes right as you're about to strike. Now, I'm not talking about like... I'm talking about you're looking at it and then at the last second you close your eyes. Okay? You might want some sort of tarp or ground cloth. And what you're going to do is you're going to be flint napping. You're going to be making all this debitage. Debitage is just a really fancy flint napper's term for gravel. Okay, debitage. But it's actually an archaeologist's term, which is why you're going to do this next thing. You're going to have your tarp or ground cloth. You're going to be flint napping. All your debitage is going to go onto the tarp. When you get rid of your flakes, you're going to dig a hole. Now see, I always tell people this, but then I'm thinking to myself, are archaeologists really this stupid? But you dig a hole and you put a penny or a quarter or something that's got the date on it that's going to last for 1,000,000 years, and then you put the debitage in, because the debitage that I make looks exactly the same as debitage that was made 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. This thing is the same type of thing that people made back in the day, so if I drop this somewhere and it gets weathered, then all of a sudden the archaeologists think that there was an obsidian trading route that came through the Pine Barrens and ended here in this place where there was also a survival school. It's like I was watching this one comedian and he was talking about how they tell you to put on the life vest. When the plane goes down, he's like, and that's so that when the archaeologists come by in 1,000 years, they think that this is a dry lake bed that this plane landed in, but really it's just you put on the life vest. I guess it was funnier when I saw it than when I told it. Sorry.
I get it.
And one thing you might want, which is an optional thing, but this is going to increase your skill, is a grease pencil. Now, why would you want the grease pencil? Because when you get to a certain point, you're going to look at the stone and you're going to say, I want to remove a flake right here, and this is how I think the flake is going to travel. And you take your grease pencil and you draw it on the stone where you think you're going to be able to remove. And then you strike and remove the flake, and then you see how close your estimation was to what you removed. Now you can just eyeball it if you want, but that's just another way to push your skill, because you're going to get to that point. As you're working with these stones, you want to work in a really well ventilated area. I used to have a napping pit in my room, and what I'd do is I'd stick a box fan in the window, open the window up, stick a box fan in, and then I'd put a fan on me so that the fan was blowing across me. I don't want it behind me, but I want it to blow across where I'm working. Because as you strike the stone, you are creating millions of tiny little particles that are shaped just like this and are just as sharp as this, but on a microscopic level. And you're breathing that in, and it's slicing up your lungs, okay, a little bit at a time. And you get what's called fibrosis, which is there's so much scar tissue in your lungs that your lungs don't function the same, and you can't breathe as well, and it can kill you. But you'd have to be napping in a basement. Now, back when people discovered, gunpowder and used gun flints to shoot their guns, there were nappers who didn't need to make stone tools as much because they were already using knives. These were people who were master nappers who knew how to control flakes, how to control the stone as they were working it, and switched over to making gun flints. And in Denmark especially, they would take all of these nappers and they would put them in a dungeon because they didn't want anybody else to know how to make a gun flint, so that they could be the only ones who could make guns, because they were the only ones who had people who had gun flints. And you had all these guys in basements, in dungeons, napping, and they were dying when they were like 30, 35, because they were breathing in all of that dust all the time. Okay, so don't be like those guys. Don't nap in your basement. Don't nap in your garage. Don't nap inside unless you have really good ventilation. So I always try to nap on a breezy day, but whatever. I don't worry about it that much. If I'm outside, I feel pretty good about it, but it is preferable if there's a breeze. So your form, how are you going to be doing this? Now you could be, if you want to, like Thack or Ugg or one of those cavemen, and just pick up your rock and smash it on the ground, and it will produce a flake. It will break, and you'll probably get a sharp edge. So if you're out there and it's survival and it's dark out and you just need a sharp edge and you don't want to sit down and try to nap something out, you can just pick up rocks and smash them until you get a sharp edge. You will get a flake, but there's absolutely, positively no control whatsoever. Okay? A next method that you could use, and this would be especially helpful for really tough stones, is indirect percussion. It's anvil technique. I'm sorry, I was confused my notes. It's anvil technique. The anvil. Okay, so this would be, you'd have some anvil. Let's just imagine that this was stone. And this one's pretty dangerous. Okay? It's also called block on block. Some people call it block on block. But you got your anvil stone, and you're striking the anvil stone with the material that you're trying to remove the flake from. So I'm trying to get a flake off of this rock. Instead of striking this rock with another rock, I'm striking a big rock with the rock I'm working with. And generally what I do, and I'll demonstrate this, is I'll have the rock on the ground, and I want my anvil to be rounded so that I can be more accurate with it. And if this was my anvil, what I try to do is strike it so that when I'm hitting it, the rock is traveling this way, so the flake will go that way and not straight up into my eyeball or my forehead or something like that. So I'm striking it, and I'm kind of turning my head, and I'm striking it so that it's going that way. Does that make sense? And most of the time when you use that, you're going to be like really just, you're going for some force. You got to use a lot of force to remove a flake.
Can you use a real anvil?
Nah, you don't want to use steel. It's not as good. Remember I was saying that you want your hammer stone to be soft so that it grips it for that fraction of a second. Steel is not going to be grippy at all, and it's going to bounce off. That's why you would use copper if you used a metal. You don't want to use brass or steel or cast iron or anything like that. Like, I'm losing one. Oh no, he saved. He was like, and as soon as I said that, he was like, oh, I started writing in his notes. I was like, ah, nice, smooth, well done. So that is the anvil technique. And then there is indirect percussion, which is where you take your stone and you have some sort of chisel. This isn't a chisel, okay, but some sort of chisel in quotations. And you're going to take that thing and you're going to put it right where you want to remove the flake from, and you're going to strike your quote-unquote chisel instead of striking the rock. Okay, so it's going to produce a different looking flake. The chisel is going to make it, I'm not even going to get into that just yet. It's going to make a different flake that is not preferable for beginners, but you can be very accurate with it. You know you're not going to miss, because if you're off by a fraction of an inch sometimes, especially as it gets more and more refined, if you're off by a fraction of an inch, it's the difference between having a really nice arrowhead and two small arrowheads with a flat base on them. Okay?
What do you use as a chisel?
Anything that's going to, anything. A piece of antler. This, mine's sitting over there, but I couldn't find it, so I didn't want to root through all my stuff. But it's just an antler tine. I use this. Okay, I'm just using the term chisel. It's not actually a chisel. I just didn't know what else to call it.
Something smaller.
Little grommet, a little piece of something. You're placing something up against the stone that you are then striking that thing instead of striking the stone.
What's different between that and your chisel piece? Is
Between this,
it just the shape?
yeah, the shape and the length. But this will totally work as one.
Okay.
Okay, and then the one that you're going to use the most is going to be the direct percussion, which is where you're sitting the thing there and you're striking it. Okay? So the anvil technique, I already explained how you do that. Bashing is understandable, and the indirect is very understandable. So for direct percussion, oh, you know what, while I'm at it, so this greenstone axe was made in a different fashion, or was finished in a different way than a spear point like this. This is part of the reason why this can be the most depressing thing you'll work on. Because I didn't put that many hours into it, but I put a lot of time into this spear point. And as I was working it, I ate too much broccoli or something that morning. I was feeling it. It was all strong, and I just went with a little bit too much force. And right here on the very, very last flake, literally the last flake of this whole pass before I refined it and finished it off, the flake went too far, traveled all the way across the edge, curled, and took out a big chunk on the other side. Okay, so this is just my example of how depressing this can be. It makes me wonder why I continue to do it. But I can't help myself. So, your form is very important. Your form is very, very important. So, what you're going to do is you are going to have your leg pad on your leg, and you want to be sitting. Now, this chair isn't good for flint napping. I'm just happen to be sitting on it. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about that you just showed.
Uh-huh.
Is it like broken? Can you still use it?
Oh, I can still use it, but it's just not pretty.
Are we on aesthetics?
So, this is the problem. This is the problem with our modern brains. Okay, is that pre-Columbus, not Colombian like Colombia, but pre-Columbian natives in the United States. If I looked at my flint napping ability and compared it to those people, I'm in the top 1% of flint nappers of those times. Literally, I'm probably in the top 0.5%, maybe even the top 1/3%. And what I mean is that most of those natives couldn't produce anything anywhere near this nice. And any of those guys would be like, like the Quest for Fire, and they'd be lashing it and they'd be stabbing stuff with it and happy as hell. But I'm all picky because I want it to look super perfect. Don't be like me. Don't be where you think every single, like I want the flake scar to match up, and I want to have perfect flake scar pattern, and I want it to be, the perfect cross section and as straight a line as I possibly can. But for survival purposes, man, this thing was ready a long time ago. Okay, so don't be like me. Is this still usable? Hell yeah, this is still usable, but I can't put it in my case now because now it's got a big chunk missing. What to do with it?
Just aesthetics?
Yeah, well, yeah, basically. No. When I go for, how many times have I ever stabbed a deer with a spear? I haven't stabbed a deer with a spear yet. That's pretty hard to do. And it's pretty intense, and it's pretty illegal in all states except for Alabama. So, I can't do that yet, which means I'm going to Alabama! But I go for aesthetics because there's a direct correlation between how aesthetically pleasing, when I say aesthetics, I mean like that all the dimensions are correct and how sharp you can get it.
Symmetry.
Okay, so if I get the right cross section and the right width to thickness, and I have a clean scar pattern, it's going to be a sharper tool than if it's really rough.
That makes sense then.
But yeah, but there's a certain thing called sharp enough. When you guys are all sharpening your knives and you're trying to shave and you're like, damn it, and you go back to the knife sharpener and you try to shave and you're back to the knife sharpener and you're like, you know what, I like my arm hair, this is sharp enough. You just go for it and start carving with it. So there is something that's called sharp enough, but I just don't bother with that. So, back to the form. Oh, you know what? Let me just complete the story of how you make one of these, because I don't want to have to go back to it. So, this is good, too, because it shows the stages. So, for something like this, it's really, really hard to work. This is greenstone from Virginia. It's I think the technical name for it, the scientific name is a Catoctin metabasalt. It's a basalt. And they call it greenstone, but it's more blue than it is green. But when you polish it up, it kind of gets a greenish tinge to it. And there are different tight grain basalts all over the world that are good for this. But this one is the best in the world, I think. But actually, no, there's one in Papua New Guinea that they can get it really, really thin. But basically, the manufacture of these is you start off with this big rock that's nearly impossible to break. And I normally start off with one that is as close to an axe looking as I can possibly find. Okay, so most of the work is already done by nature. And then I'll take it and I'll start by doing that block on block. And I'm just breaking this thing and roughing it out. Okay, I'm moving it around and I'm rough shaping it. Okay, and after I get it to rough shape, and I get it to a point where I can't strike it anymore, or can't take a flake off of it anymore without getting it too thin, because there's a certain angle You want this to be like 60 degrees right here, but you don't have to worry about that. You can read about that anywhere. So if it gets too thin, you're screwed. So then the next part of the manufacture of this is pectin ground. This is a pectin ground celt head or kelt head. Okay, pectin ground. What do they call it? Petaloid. I forget what they call it. It's pecked and ground. Okay, so this would be a different manufacture process. You do the rough flaking till it's generally axe head shaped, but not quite finished yet. And you're at a point where if you keep removing flakes, it's just going to get smaller and smaller. And you get a rock that is harder than this rock, and you peck at it. Okay, 15 minutes of napping this thing will save me, is like equal to an hour of pecking this thing. And then after I'm done pecking it for the final finish, I'm going to get a piece of soft sandstone and put some water and some sand on the sandstone, and I'm going to grind it to finish it. 15 minutes of pecking is equal to an hour or so of grinding. So the more you can remove in the flint knapping process, the less pecking you have to do and the less grinding you have to do. Has anybody made one of these or known anybody who made it? How many hours did it take you?
Like a long time. I think it took me like all day, and I didn't even finish it.
10 hours. Very short amount of time. That most people will tell you that these things take like 40, 50, 60 hours. Okay, it doesn't take you 40 or 50 or 60 hours. If you continue to flint knap it until it is as flint knapped as it can possibly be. This one that I've been working on, my friends are like, dude, you got to stop napping. You're going to break it. You're going to ruin it. You're going to break it. You're going to ruin it. And then I was talking to Dr. Callahan, and he was like, hell yeah, you're going to break it? That's what you're trying to do in the first place. Okay. And he saved me hours of work. So, what's that?
Can you repeat your formula, your time formula?
An hour of flint knapping, if you're knapping this thing, is going to be worth, 15 minutes of flint knapping this thing is going to be worth an hour of pecking it. And 15 minutes of pecking it is going to be worth an hour of grinding it. Okay, so the longer you can spend at each stage. Okay, and that's just generally how you make one of these. These aren't rocket science, but let me tell you, this thing is effective. It works. It just changes the edge angle. And then when you're hafting it, I'm not even going to get into hafting because I'm just already giving you more than I'm supposed to anyway. Okay, pecked and ground axes. You nap it to rough shape, you peck it until it's almost done, and you stop it before it gets too sharp, and then you grind it to finish it. Okay, so